The first time Emily called me home, I cried after hanging up the phone. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, standing alone in my kitchen while the kettle screamed behind me and rain tapped against the windows like old memories asking to come inside. "Thank you for dinner tonight," she had said before ending the call. "Being with you feels like home." At 68 years old, I had forgotten what those words could do to a lonely heart. My husband, Walter, had been gone for 11 years. Cancer took him slowly, cruelly, one season at a time. After he passed, the house became unbearably quiet. The clocks sounded louder. The floors creaked more. Even the refrigerator humming at night felt like proof that silence had become my only permanent companion. My son Daniel visited when he could, but life pulls children away, even the good ones. I never blamed him for that. Then Emily entered his life. She was 27. With soft brown hair she constantly tucked behind her ear when nervous. She smiled carefully, like someone who had learned not to expect warmth from the world too quickly. The first evening Daniel brought her over, she stood awkwardly at my doorway holding a peach pie wrapped in a towel. "I made this myself," she said. "I hope it's edible." Daniel laughed immediately. "Mom already loves you." And somehow, he was right. During dinner, Emily listened to every story I told as though my memories mattered. Most young people politely wait for older people to stop speaking. Emily leaned closer. "What was your wedding like?" she asked. "What did Mr. Walters say when he proposed? What was Daniel like as a child?" No one had asked me those things in years. That night after they left, I washed dishes slowly, smiling to myself for the first time in months. After that, Emily began calling often. Sometimes she asked for recipes. Sometimes she called just to hear another voice after work. Once, she phoned me crying quietly because she and Daniel had argued. "I don't know why I called you," she admitted. "Yes, you do," I told her gently. And she laughed through tears. Little by little, she became part of my daily life. We went grocery shopping together on Saturdays. She helped me replant flowers in the garden Walter once cared for. On cold evenings, we sat at the kitchen table drinking tea while she told me stories about her difficult childhood, how unstable everything had felt growing up, how deeply she craved belonging. I understood that feeling more than she realized. Loneliness recognizes loneliness. One afternoon, while folding laundry together, Emily looked at me suddenly and said, "You know, I never really had a safe home before." My hands stopped moving. She continued quietly, "But here feels different." I remember looking at her then, not as my son's girlfriend, but as a young woman carrying invisible exhaustion inside her. Without thinking, I reached over and squeezed her hand. "You'll always have a place here," I said. Her eyes filled immediately, and mine did too. That was the beginning of everything. The trust, the love, the opening of doors that should perhaps have remained guarded a little longer. But the hardest thing about betrayal is this. It rarely begins with bad people. Sometimes it begins with wounded people being loved so completely that they slowly forget the value of what they were given. After Daniel and Emily got married, my house felt alive again for a little while. That is what makes painful changes so confusing at first. They rarely begin with cruelty. They begin with comfort. Warm dinners, shared laughter, familiar footsteps in empty hallways. Daniel convinced me to let them stay with me temporarily while they saved money for their own place. "It'll only be for a year or two," he promised gently. "And honestly, Mom, I hate the thought of you being here alone." I smiled and agreed before he even finished asking. Truthfully, I was happy. The mornings no longer began in silence. I woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of cabinet doors opening downstairs. Emily often hummed softly while cooking breakfast, and Daniel fixed little things around the house Walter used to handle himself. For the first time in years, the dining table had all 3 chairs occupied again. I told myself life had given me something back. But comfort can change quietly. So quietly you almost blame yourself for noticing it. At first it was small things. Emily stopped sitting with me after dinner. Instead of drinking tea together, she and Daniel disappeared upstairs earlier each night. Their laughter became private. Their conversations lowered whenever I entered the room. Then came the pauses. Those painful little silences that happen when people have been speaking freely moments before you arrived. One afternoon, I walked into the dining room carrying folded towels and heard Emily say softly, "She doesn't really need all this space anymore." The room froze when they noticed me standing there. Daniel cleared his throat quickly. "We were just talking about renovating the upstairs." I smiled politely, but something deep inside me became still, not angry, just alert. After that day, I started noticing more. Bills addressed to me had already been opened and stacked neatly on the counter before I saw them. Papers on my desk were moved slightly out of place. Daniel suddenly asked unusual questions about insurance, property taxes, and whether I had updated my will recently. None of it sounded terrible on its own. That is the dangerous thing about emotional dishonesty. It hides inside reasonable conversations. Emily changed too, though more subtly. She still hugged me goodbye, still thanked me for meals, still smiled kindly. But warmth without sincerity feels different once you sense it, like sunlight through cold glass. The thing that hurt me most was not greed. It was distance. She stopped calling me late at night just to talk. She no longer asked about Walter or my younger years. She stopped saying our home and began saying your house. I noticed every change. Older women notice everything. We simply learn not to interrupt people while they reveal themselves. One rainy evening, I passed Daniel's office downstairs and heard their voices through the slightly open door. Emily sounded tired. If the house gets transferred later, it'll become complicated legally. Daniel sighed heavily. I know. We've spent years here already, she continued softly. We've helped maintain everything. I just think we deserve some stability too. Deserve. Such a quiet word. Such a heavy one. I stood frozen in the hallway holding a basket of laundry against my chest, while my heart slowly broke in complete silence. Not because they wanted security, but because I finally understood something painful. They had begun seeing my love as an arrangement instead of a gift. And somehow, without realizing it, I had slowly disappeared inside my own home. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen long after they went upstairs. The clock ticked loudly beside me while untouched tea grew cold in my hands. For the first time in my life, my house no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a place where people were quietly waiting for my absence while pretending to wait for my presence. And there is no loneliness deeper than realizing you have become emotionally invisible in the very home where you once held everyone together. Pain changes as you grow older. When you are young, heartbreak arrives loudly. People cry, argue, slam doors, demand answers. But old heartbreak is quieter. It sits beside you at breakfast, while everyone speaks around you instead of to you. It follows you through hallways that once carried laughter. It watches silently while trust slowly changes shape inside familiar faces. After the conversation I overheard outside Daniel's office, something inside me awakened. Not anger, not bitterness, but clarity. For weeks, I said nothing. And silence became my teacher. I started waking earlier than usual, sitting alone in the kitchen before the others came downstairs. Those peaceful mornings gave me space to think clearly instead of emotionally. I realized how often I had ignored my own discomfort simply because I was afraid of feeling lonely again. Loneliness can make a person overgive, over-explain, over-forgive. I had spent years believing love meant keeping everyone comfortable, even when it quietly cost me my peace. One afternoon, Emily entered the kitchen while I was peeling apples. "You okay?" she asked casually. I looked at her carefully. Her voice still sounded sweet. Her smile still appeared gentle. But now I noticed something I had missed before: concern without connection, kindness without emotional presence. "I'm fine," I answered softly. And for the first time, I kept my deeper feelings to myself, not out of punishment, out of protection. That was new for me. As days passed, I observed more than I spoke. Daniel had become restless around me, especially whenever finances or future plans were mentioned. Sometimes he would begin sentences and stop halfway. "Mom, eventually we should probably..." Then silence. Emily became unusually helpful whenever important documents arrived in the mail. She organized drawers I never asked her to touch. Once, I found my folder containing insurance papers sitting open on the dining room table. She apologized quickly. "I was just trying to help clean up." I nodded politely, but wisdom often arrives through patterns, not incidents. And the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The painful truth was not that they hated me. They didn't. That would have been easier to understand. The truth was sadder. They had slowly started seeing me less as a person and more as a future solution to their fears. A house, security, stability. And perhaps without meaning to, they had begun emotionally measuring my value through what I could leave behind. One evening, Daniel approached me carrying a folder. "There are some papers I think we should discuss," he said carefully. I looked at his trembling hands before taking off my reading glasses. "What kind of papers?" "Nothing serious," he replied too quickly. "Just planning things for the future, to make everything easier later." Later. Again that word. I opened the folder slowly and saw property documents clipped neatly together. Something inside me should have shattered in that moment. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Because deep down, I already knew. I closed the folder gently and placed it back into his hands. I've already handled my future, Daniel. His face changed instantly. What do you mean? I held his gaze quietly this time. He looked away first. The following week, I met with my lawyer and finalized the decision I had been considering for months. After my passing, the house Walter and I built together would be placed into a charitable trust, supporting widowed women rebuilding their lives after loss. Not out of revenge. Never revenge. Pain handled with revenge only creates more pain. I simply refused to let my home become something whispered over behind closed doors. Daniel would still receive family heirlooms, photographs, and enough financial support to live comfortably. I was not abandoning him. I was protecting the dignity of what Walter and I spent a lifetime creating. When I finally explained my decision, silence filled the room. Emily looked stunned. Daniel looked wounded. "Mom," he whispered, "you don't trust us?" I looked at my son, the little boy I once carried through fevers, heartbreaks, failures, and fears. Then I answered honestly. Love without respect slowly becomes entitlement. And entitlement is where families begin losing each other. No one argued. Because sometimes truth enters a room so gently, it leaves no space for denial. And strangely, after months of hidden tension, I slept peacefully that night for the first time in a very long while. Daniel and Emily moved out quietly in the middle of winter. There was no dramatic argument. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just careful politeness carrying the weight of unspoken disappointment. The morning they left, snow covered the edges of the driveway, and the sky looked pale and tired. Daniel loaded boxes into the car, while Emily folded coats silently into the back seat. I stood near the front window pretending to straighten curtains so they would not see the sadness on my face. Because despite everything, I still loved them. That is the difficult truth about family. Love does not disappear simply because trust does. Before leaving, Daniel stepped inside one last time. "You'll call if you need anything?" he asked softly. I smiled gently. "I'll be all right." He nodded, but his eyes filled with guilt he could no longer hide. For one painful second, I almost told him to stay. Almost. But wisdom sometimes means resisting the urge to rescue people from the consequences of their own emotional distance. So instead, I kissed his cheek and whispered, "Take care of your heart, Daniel. Life hardens people quietly." Then he left, and the silence returned. But this silence felt different from the loneliness I carried after Walter died. That silence had been grief. This silence felt honest. For several weeks, the house felt unbearably large again. I still caught myself listening for footsteps upstairs, or Emily humming in the kitchen. Sometimes I set out 3 coffee mugs before realizing there was no one else there. Old habits take time to release. But slowly, something surprising happened. I began breathing easier. There were no whispered conversations stopping when I entered rooms. No tension hidden beneath politeness. No feeling that my presence needed justification inside my own home. One early spring morning, I walked into the backyard and noticed Walter's old garden beds buried beneath weeds and dead branches. I stood there quietly for a long time. Then I rolled up my sleeves. The next morning, I bought seeds. Lavender, roses, white daisies. Tiny, fragile things that required patience, sunlight, and steady care. A bit like people, every day I worked in the garden with aching knees and dirt beneath my fingernails. And somehow, while loosening roots and trimming dead stems, I felt parts of myself healing too. Pain, I learned, cannot survive forever in a life still willing to grow. By summer, the backyard had transformed completely. Lavender swayed against the fence. Roses climbed carefully along wooden arches Walter once built with his own hands decades earlier. Neighbors began stopping by just to admire it. "You've brought this place back to life," one woman told me. I smiled softly. "No," I answered. "I think it brought me back." Then one afternoon in early autumn, Emily appeared at my front door alone. She looked thinner, quieter, older somehow, not in years but in spirit. I invited her inside without hesitation. We sat at the kitchen table where we once drank tea together like family, untouched by misunderstanding. For a long moment she said nothing. Then tears filled her eyes. "I owe you an apology." I waited quietly. She looked down at her hands. I think somewhere along the way, I became so afraid of insecurity that I started seeing people through fear instead of love. Her voice trembled, "And you didn't deserve that." The strange thing was, I had imagined this moment many times before. In earlier versions of my hurt, I pictured myself making her feel guilty, making her fully understand my pain. But sitting there across from her, I realized something important. Peace leaves no hunger for revenge. So I simply reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. "We all become selfish when fear leads us," I said softly. "The important thing is recognizing it before it becomes who we are." She cried quietly after that. Not dramatic tears, human tears. Before leaving, Emily stepped into the backyard garden and stood silently among the flowers glowing beneath the evening sun. "It's beautiful," she whispered. I looked around slowly, breathing in the lavender carried by warm wind. "Yes," I said. "Peace usually is." After she left, I remained outside until sunset painted the sky gold and pale pink. Birds settled into the trees Walter once planted, and for the first time in years, my heart felt light. Not because life became perfect, but because I finally understood this. You can love people deeply and still protect your dignity. You can forgive without reopening every door. And sometimes the strongest women are not the loudest ones. They are the gentle women who quietly choose self-respect after a lifetime of giving pieces of themselves away.